Gerrymandering. It's a big part of democratic decline. And it might sound like it's a boring topic, but it's not. And it's critically important. And beneath the mechanics of how it occurs, there's some really consequential questions about democratic legitimacy itself. And electoral systems don't just become destabilizing simply because new lines are drawn. They become destabilized because political actors are either deliberately engineering structural advantages that ultimately weaken representation, reduce accountability, and erode public trust in democratic institutions. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International List podcast, where we discuss the topics that really matter. Today's guest has spent years investigating precisely this issue. His name is David Daley, and he's a journalist, he's a political commentator, and he's the best-selling author of Rat Fucked. When this examines how partisan redistricting strategies have really reshaped American politics. Now, his book was written back in 2010, and I think he, like many others, had hoped and thought that that was going to be his last book and maybe his last word on the topic. But what we've seen is redistricting and ultimately gerrymandering has gone off at a huge pace over the last couple of months. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Let's jump in. David, welcome to the International Viz podcast.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
David, whereabouts in the world are you today?
I am in Massachusetts, in New England, just a couple of hours away from Boston, sort of in between Boston and New York City.
Very cool. Fantastic. It's a cool part of the world. I'm going to have to hook you up when I'm traveling through the States next time. David, gerrymandering. How big a problem is it? Why are we even talking about it today? Should we be worried about it?
Yes, absolutely. This is a huge problem. When you look at the elements that have led to America and this moment of really a broken, structurally deformed democracy, redistricting and gerrymandering is a giant piece of the problem. We are fundamentally alone among modern democracies around the world in allowing politicians to draw their own districts and to choose their own voters. And we've done this here for as long as we've had politicians. You can track this back to the, you know, days of the Revolutionary War and, Patrick Henry trying to keep James Madison out of the very first Congress. Just down the road from me in Boston, there was a governor named Elbridge Gerry with a hard G who drew state Senate lines around Boston in such a way as to advantage his party and disadvantage the hated Federalists. But redistricting has really changed over the course of those 200 years. And now the power to draw district lines is powered by sophisticated mapping software and very powerful computers and voluminous voter data. And you can go up and down streets and decide who is in, who is out in a way that was only guesswork even a decade or two ago. It is so precise and the country is so polarized that the ability to draw district lines is the ability to choose winners and losers in the legislative elections that are supposed to be closest to the people themselves. This has made our politics fundamentally more extreme. And as we've seen in the last couple of months here, it has accelerated and gotten dramatically worse.
And I think this is particularly important as we come into the midterm elections. This is something that has national implications right across the US, and of course, that has international implications. The Trump administration certainly controls the White House, the Senate, and the House, and potentially also the Supreme Court as well. And who controls and who wins these midterms will determine whether the Trump administration has another 2 years of free control, or whether Trump becomes potentially a lame duck president for his last 2 years. And this gerrymandering really heated up when Texas pushed for new maps last year, and this sparked this partisan response where I think there's now 10 states: Alabama, California, Florida, Louisiana, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas, and now Utah have all been pushing for new maps. Now, I understand that some states like California and New York are constrained because they've got independent commissions or limits. But can you talk to us about this map arms race and, how is it legal and where are we today? Is it actually going to make a difference in the midterms?
It very much could make a difference in the midterms, right? Donald Trump started this mid-decade arms race last summer when he picked up the phone and called Texas and demanded that they draw an additional 5 Republican seats there. And the reason he did that is because Republicans only had a 3-seat advantage in the US House. And they were heading into a midterm election here in which historically the party in power tends to lose seats in Congress during the midterm. So Trump was looking at the likelihood of a Democratic US House. Texas and those additional 5 seats were meant to become a bulwark of sorts. What that kicked off was, in fact, a redistricting arms race nationwide. And I would divide it into two different pieces. One is a partisan gerrymandering piece, and the other is a racial gerrymandering piece. And so, partisan gerrymandering, there are essentially no constraints on this. The US Supreme Court back in 2019 said that, partisan gerrymandering is a political issue and it is best left up to individual states and folks to try to handle and manage at that level. And as a result, it essentially incentivized all of these states to go ahead and draw wildly tilted extreme maps because they knew that there would be no federal intervention. Many states allow for mid-decade gerrymandering. They allow lawmakers to go in essentially at any time, not just every 10 years after the census when this is ordinarily done. So what Texas did was unprecedented and historic, but certainly still legal. California answered back. They came up with a map that took an additional 5 Republican seats. So the idea there was to level it out and even the playing field. Missouri, North Carolina, and Ohio went next, and they grabbed an additional 4 seats for the Republicans. And then voters in Virginia authorized a pickup of 4 seats for the Democrats there. Their state's Supreme Court later stepped in and said that that was not passed properly. But I think the Democrats likely still pick up a couple of seats in Virginia anyway. The other piece of this is that as this was going on, the US Supreme Court decided another case. This was a case out of Louisiana. It was called the Calais case. It had to do with the Voting Rights Act, and it had to do with protections that ensured that voters of color, Black and Latino voters, especially across the South, would not be cracked and packed and sliced and diced into districts in which they had no opportunity to elect members of their own choosing. The court said that that itself was unconstitutional, and that allowed all of these southern states that had been blocked by the Voting Rights Act from previously taking part in this mid-districting Armageddon to jump in. And that's when Alabama and Louisiana and Tennessee and Florida get involved. But redistricting is going to give Republicans about an extra 10 or 11 seat cushion this year than they would have had otherwise.
And I think your point is really valid. And I know when we look historically that the person that or the party that holds the White House usually loses the House in the midterm elections. And certainly Trump has made a lot of things, including the illegal attacks on Iran, of course, the inflationary pressure that we've seen in the US. Now the job numbers are a little bit better, but I think everyone's still agreeing that whilst the S&P and the Nasdaq are roaring, the cost of living for average Americans is incredibly painful. And I've been reading some amazing statistics. One of them that 40% of US households are in debt because of health costs. I mean, just really, really staggering. It's such a fantastic country with amazing universities, amazing companies, but a huge portion of the population is still really, really struggling. And that has to weigh on an incumbent. That has to weigh on President Trump as we're going into the November elections. But with that said, can you help us? And you predicted, I think you said 10 or so seats, that cushion that the Republicans are likely to have. Talk to us about the map. Now, I know America has amazing technology. I know America is leading the world in so many regards, but how can they actually do that? How do they know at a household by household level which way to draw the maps? I mean, my mind boggles as to how they could even mathematically actually do it. Forget the legality of it, but how do you actually do gerrymandering? Help us out.
There are unbelievable computer software mapping programs that are so precise. You look at them and it is like you are playing a video game. It is just, back in RadEft, I sat down with map makers and they showed me how it's done. And they have so much information at their fingertips. They've got all of the census data, which tells you so much about every single neighborhood and household. They have all of the voting records in every election going back, you know, years and years, not just at the presidential level, but at the very local level. Are you showing up in town elections? Are you showing up in the off years? Are you showing up in primary elections? That gives them lots of information about turnout, especially, and who can be expected to actually show up. There's all of the public data sets, right? We are scattering information about ourselves that allows us, in the hands of these map makers, to be sorted into districts in which our vote is deeply diminished.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting. I think this is perhaps a good pause for anyone that lives in a country, and particularly I'm speaking to a lot of our European audiences, where they think that it's totally fine for the government to collect the information. What would they ever do with it that's bad? And we've had some recent conversations with people about Palantir and their access to health data in the UK and police data in the UK, and whilst the services are potentially in better, considering how the government could use this data. I think you give a really great case study there. I'd love to talk about the morality of it. I mean, the fact that it seems that whilst the Republicans started it, perhaps in this occasion with the when Trump called the Texans, certainly both sides have participated in gerrymandering at least recently, but that doesn't make it okay. And the fact that it's legally tolerated still doesn't make it okay because I think most people would argue that it definitely weakens voter choice. It definitely weakens voter choice if your house is being moved from one district to another to make your vote count or not count. And it means that politicians are picking their voters instead of voters picking their politicians, which is such a interesting way. How do political parties justify this when they've really flipped the political system?
They believe that the ends justify the means. The story that I tell in Radeft is about how Republicans recognized that this was a viable political strategy in this moment. In 2008, America not only elects its first black president in Barack Obama, but Democrats have a supermajority in the US Senate, big majorities in the House, and the smartest political observers in both parties believe that this could be a generational realignment, that Republicans could be on the outs demographically for some time to come. The 2008 election might have been historic, but the 2010 election would be much more consequential because America runs a census in years ending in zero. Immediately after that, we redraw every state legislative and congressional district. And what they understood was that if they could win back state legislatures, about 100 seats around the country in these, local places, that they would have the power to draw just about half of Congress 100% on their own, and that they could use this new technology to lock up huge advantages. So this has pushed our politics wildly to extremes. It has gutted the number of competitive seats nationwide. We only had 34 or 435 seats in 2024 that were within 5 percentage points. I expect that by 2026, that it could even be cut in half. By 2028, as the redistricting wars continue, because Democrats come 2028 will be able to further retaliate in a number of additional states that they could not at this time around. That number could dwindle even further. This is going to be a really complicated problem for us to get out from under.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about why this problem matters, not just in America but broader. But David, gerrymandering, it's often framed as a domestic political issue, and that's how we've been discussing it so far. But we increasingly see democratic erosion, we see institutional instability in the US, but we see that globally, and it's been a global trend consistently every year for the last 2 decades, an increasing erosion of democracy around the world. From your perspective, why should we be thinking about gerrymandering in the US as not just a local issue, but something that impacts international risk much more broadly?
We have radically altered the electoral incentives in this country in such a way that we have put people in office um, that could never have been elected even 10 or 15 years ago, and that has had consequences for our politics. It's had, deep consequences for our our foreign relations and our approach to the rest of the world. One of my favorite examples of this comes from North Carolina, a southern state, but essentially a 51-49 Republican state. Democrats win statewide elections there pretty often, but Republicans took control of the state legislature there back in 2010 and drew themselves a map on which they uh, won about 80% of the seats. And there was a swing district, a really close competitive district in the western part of the state that went back and forth between Republicans and Democrats all of the time. And the Democrat who held that seat, one of the more conservative Democrats in Congress, looks at it in 2012 under the new lines and says, "I can't win here. I'm going to retire." It was a safely drawn Republican seat. It was going to be decided in the Republican primary. One of the big issues in that moment, right, was an early Donald Trump question about was Barack Obama, an American or not? And so these candidates are being asked this, and the front runner says essentially, "I'm not all that interested in that question. I think he's probably an American." And the next candidate gets up and recognizes his opportunity. And he says, "If I'm elected, I'm going to send Barack Obama back to Kenya or wherever it is he comes from." That guy's name was Mark Meadows. He wins the seat. He becomes one of the most conservative members of Congress, pushing for government shutdowns. In Donald Trump's first term, he becomes Trump's chief of staff, one of the most powerful men in the world. He owes his seat to partisan gerrymandering. The kinds of people making decisions who would not have had that kind of power at all in an electoral system that is balanced and actually candidates need to have mandates and majorities actually rule.
And if we rewind the clocks a little bit, there was Project Red Map, and I know you've spoken and written quite a lot about this. And this is when Republicans, really looked and targeted at state legislatures so they could control the redistricting after the 2010 census, and this ultimately shaped at least a decade of maps that helped Republican House dominance. Now, the Democrats have clearly learned from it, and they're much more aware of this playbook, and they're adopting similar counter strategies in the current redistricting fights. And I think this is, perhaps what's inspired this current arms race that we're seeing today. But the critic in me says, well, okay, we've had 16 years to learn from it. And the Democrats have clearly learned from it, and the Republicans are still implementing some of the strategies today. But as I said, the critic in me is asking, well, hold on, we've also had 16 years to learn this is not democracy. This is not how we're meant to be running our political systems. How come? How come the Nancy Pelosi's, the Joe Bidens, the Bernie Sanders, how come some of the more outspoken members of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, how come they're not speaking out? How come they're not doing something to ban these mid-census restructuring and gerrymandering activities?
I really think that the answer to your question lies with the US Supreme Court. voters were making a lot of headway on fixing this. In the years after Donald Trump's election in 2016, there was a lot of energy towards a structural reform, a lot of energy around independent redistricting commissions. They begin to be passed first in Arizona and California. Then you see voters in Florida, more than 60% of them passing gerrymandering protections into their state constitution. In 2018, Ohio, Michigan, Colorado, Missouri, and Utah a move to pass independent commissions. They are followed not long by Virginia. So this is blue states, red states, purple states, voters everywhere saying no to partisan gerrymandering and yes to meaningful competitive elections. And then the U.S. Supreme Court uh, uh, steps in. There had been litigation around the country, and lower federal courts, judges appointed by presidents of both parties, looking at maps drawn by both parties, by Democrats in Maryland, by Republicans in Ohio and North Carolina and Wisconsin and Michigan, said, we have all of the information and tools we need to fix this. And we have to do it because if we don't, no one will, because the politicians can't be trusted here because they're the ones barricading themselves into office. The courts have got to be the actual defenders of free and fair elections. And the U.S. Supreme Court in that 2019 Rucho case said no, and they closed the courts to federal gerrymandering at precisely the moment that it looked like voters had this fixed. And that removed a key threat. It told all of these states that they could go ahead and do it. And then in the Calais case, just a couple of months ago, here, the court again steps in and again makes matters worse. So, what we have to be working on as we are in the midst of this gerrymandering war is finding a solution, finding the national solution that gets us out of this. I tend to think that that's a much more proportional House along the lines that Congressman Jamie Raskin and Don Beyer have proposed here, larger multiple um, member districts, use of proportional ranked choice voting to elect members, actually get delegations from every state that look and feel like the politics and the population of that place. It's a heavy lift, but I think there's more and more awareness that that's the way that this has to go here.
I can't help but think, in Australia, there's compulsory voting. So if you don't vote in Australia, you actually get a fine. So you have to go and vote. And anyone that's listened to the International Vet podcast knows that I'm a huge advocate of democracy. I love the fierce political debates in our countries. But even in Australia, I often found it frustrating. Depending on where I was living, I was often in an extremely safe Liberal seat or an extremely safe Labor seat. And, I'd have a busy weekend and be like, oh, I've got to go and vote. It's completely pointless what my vote is because I'm in a safe Labor seat or a safe Liberal seat. The politicians aren't concentrating here because they know that this has already been tied up and it's been tied up for decades. And even I was frustrated and like, oh, what's the point in voting? If I was living in a country like the US where gerrymandering is so extreme and only likely to get more extreme, my frustrations would be so much more acute. And if we layer on top of that, there's something called the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality. And a lot more people have been talking about that lately. For example, at zero, it's perfect equality, where everyone has the exact same income. We're talking about income, not wealth, but everyone has the exact same income. Now, at the other end of the extreme, at the score of one, it's perfect inequality. So one person has all the wealth or all the income, sorry, and everyone else has none. Now, that's almost impossible. However, right now, we're seeing such a concentration of wealth. A concentration of wealth, the last time that was seen, I don't know if you know, David, that was just before the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s. That was the last time we saw the same level of concentration of wealth, where 0.1% of the population controls the majority of the wealth. It's absolutely phenomenal, the data. Really, it's worth looking at for anyone that's interested. But I just wonder when the US is at such levels, people are comparing the current Gini of coefficient in America to the French Revolution, and it's not quite as high as it was, but it is extremely high by many measures. It's getting close to zero point 0.5, which is actually very, very severe, where such a huge portion of the population is getting such a small portion of the actual income. And when you see taxes and transfers, and you see people like Elon Musk, whether you like him or loathe him, looking at being the world's first trillionaire, involved in politics as well, of course. But when you see that laid on top of gerrymandering, I just have to wonder what that says about and what the risks are for not just democracy, but the rule of law and participation, which is a critical part. What are your concerns as you look to the societal fractures and the rule of law and political participation in the coming years?
Oh, it's a great point. I mean, I think that we are in the midst of a real challenge here, and gerrymandering is a huge piece of it. But we have all of these structural problems and inequities that have really severed our politics and our policy choices from the ballot box. If you look at the kinds of policies that the United States has been enacting and the policies that we have not been enacting, and compare that to opinion polling on what it is that voters actually want to see, there is this massive disconnect. And that disconnect can, in large part, be explained through redistricting and the other structural problems that have been baked into our democracy, and how they're exploding in this moment. So if you take a redistricting, and we are on the verge of a nation that is entirely blue delegations from blue states and red delegations from red states. We've seen a map like that in this country before. Back then, we called it the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War. But then you take a look at the U.S. Senate, um, designed to give each state two seats. Well, by the end of the next decade, you're going to have 70% of Americans living in 15 states with 30 senators. So the other 70 senators will be representing 30% of the population. Very hard to have a majority rule in that consideration. There's a lot of flashing warning lights, and we need to be thinking about those big structural reforms. If Democrats have a moment to pass them, because I do imagine, not to be partisan here, but that this is going to have to be passed by a one political party, and it's more likely that it will be Democrats than Republicans here, that these kinds of big changes will have to emerge in the first 100 days of a Democratic trifecta in early 2029. And if Democrats cannot make that work, right? And they were not able to do this under the trifecta they had in the first Joe Biden months. I think all bets are off, and I think the kind of democracy we have, and who holds power in this country, and whether or not it can be taken away from them, even by majorities of Americans, will look quite different.
And I'd like to really pick that up because, it's not just America. I mean, of course, the United States has deep polarization, eroding trust in elections and courts, and of course, the media and the fake news for the last, really, what has it now been, 12 years that term's been around for. The UK, there's been massive polarization over Brexit. Immigration is increasingly a concern, and the immigration debate is just so fiery in the UK. In France, we've got extremely strong populist movements with the far right, looking like they might take the next election. It almost got the last election, and the far left is still a huge force in France. Germany, we've got a growing populist right wing party, the AfD, who's supported by many Republicans. JD Vance was there recently. Elon Musk has spoken at their rallies. Meanwhile, the German government has banned them for being an extremist organization. Italy has a long-standing populist government. They've got a far-right government in power now. We've seen Hungary under Viktor Orban recently removed, but of course Poland, Turkey, Brazil, Venezuela. The list goes on. But the United States has always positioned itself as this defender of democratic norms, as having that electoral legitimacy and legitimacy to intervene in international affairs because they are the flag bearers of democracy and what's good and right. But with all that said, and noting where we are today, What is your prediction? What is the world going to look like?
I think there is an appetite for big structural reform in the United States that I haven't seen for, my lifetime, certainly. When you look at the calls to reform Congress, when you look at the calls to reform the Supreme Court to get money out of politics for more proportional representation in our politics, we are seeing all of this. Now, it's very difficult to pass, and there's going to have to be a lot to overcome. But I think what's really important is that we do the work of reimagining a, a democracy and reimagining these institutions, because part of the reason why we're in this mess is because these institutions have failed. And it's not enough for Democrats to say in this moment, we're going to restore norms of democracy in the way that it was before, because that's not good enough. It wasn't good enough for all of these, you know, Americans or folks in countries around the world who we've been talking about with regard to income inequality, to healthcare, to the feelings Americans have around AI and the job market. There are a lot of anxieties and fears that have to be addressed, and that were not being addressed by institutions and political parties and the news media, um, in the years leading up to this moment, right? So, you know, populist movements around the world have not come from nowhere. They have been born o- out of frustration and institutional failure in many ways. And so, if Democrats want to take power back and fix this, I think we have to build institutions that actually respond to the real needs of people, and then take those needs on and help get the work done to solve those problems.
And one question that we ask all guests on the International Risk podcast, David, is when you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I think we live in a world in which we have lost trust in truth itself. I think when you look at faith in news media, when you look at the a rise of partisan news media and media silos, that we can't even agree on basic facts when we talk to one another anymore, and that's a huge loss, because we have big problems to solve. And when we can't come together and have conversations about them at all, because we have been getting our news and information from so many disparate sources, some of them trustworthy, some of them not trustworthy, it makes it, nearly impossible to have the, kind of civic conversation we need that, you know, actually, strengthens a democracy.
Well, thanks very much for explaining that, David. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk podcast.
Such a pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Well, that was a great conversation with David Daley. And I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on gerrymandering, on democracy, and of course, the international risks. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Ella Burden. I'm Dominic Bowen, host of the International Risk podcast. Thanks very much for listening. We will speak again in the next few days.